The notebook is still green. That's the first thing I notice, standing here at the edge of the North Field on an October morning in 1974, holding it in both hands the way you'd hold something that might not survive the handling. The leather has gone soft at the corners, darkened where my grandfather's thumb must have pressed 10,000 times, and the initials, stamped into the cover, have softened to a whisper. But the color, that particular shade of field green, the green of a living thing, has never left it entirely. I don't know how that's possible. I'm not sure it matters. I set it against my chest and look out at the wheat stubble, gold and quiet in the early light. The field breathes different in October than it does in summer. Slower, patient. It has already given what it had to give, and now it's resting, the way a man rests after a long run. Not empty, just still. I come back here most autumns now. My wife thinks I come to check the fence line. Maybe that's part of it. But mostly I come to stand here, in this particular spot, 4 miles east of town on a dirt road that still hasn't been paved, and remember the summer of 1952. Because that summer is the reason there's anything left to stand on. I was 18 years old. The drought that year came in like it had a purpose. June was dry. July was punishment. By the last week of July, the county agent, a man named Hurley who wore the same canvas hat every single day of every summer I ever saw him, was driving the roads in his pickup, stopping at fence lines, stepping out to run a stalk between his thumb and finger, and shaking his head before he'd even fully looked. I watched him do it on the Marsh Place, 90 acres to my west. I watched him do it at the Reinhardt farm further on. He'd stop, step out, look, shake his head, get back in the truck. He drove past my field without stopping. He was nearly a quarter-mile gone when, I was told later, he looked in his rearview mirror. He stopped the truck. He got out. He stood at my fence line for a long time, looking at 67 acres of turkey red wheat that was still, improbably, impossibly, stubbornly, green. Not the bright green of spring, a darker green, a working green, the green of something holding on to water that shouldn't have been there. All around me, Harlan County had gone the color of a paper bag, brown and flat and finished. Not the Voss place. Hurley stood at that fence for nearly 10 minutes, I was told. Then he got back in his truck without writing anything down. He drove to town and started asking questions about the Voss boy. People had questions about me that summer. Most of them were not kind ones. But I should go back to March, because that's where it started. That's where it always starts, in my experience. Not with the moment that tests you, but with the moment that hands you the test without explaining the rules. My grandfather died on a Tuesday, March 3rd, 1952. The ground was still frozen hard enough to ring when you struck it with a boot heel, and the county lawyer drove out from Cordell, on roads that were more frost-heave than road, to tell me what the old man had left behind. 67 acres on Meeker Line, 4 miles east of town. The farmhouse, the north barn, a 1939 farmall that needed a new magneto and 2 replaced gaskets, a dark green Ford flatbed with a crack running through the passenger mirror like a bolt of lightning caught in glass, and a lien. $1,100, held by First Consolidated Bank of Cordell, due and payable no later than the 1st of September. I had visited the farm every summer as a boy. I knew the smell of it, hay and iron, and the particular dry wood smell the farmhouse got in the heat. I knew which step on the porch would take your foot through if you trusted it. I knew the old man's habits well enough to picture them, up before light, coffee on the wood stove, out to the barn before the birds had settled into their noise for the day. What I didn't know was how to run it. I was 18 years old and I had finished school, and I had not, in the estimation of most people in Harlan County, done a single thing yet that would recommend me for this particular work. Raymond Pell made that point, with the kind of politeness that costs nothing. He was the loan officer at First Consolidated, a careful, thin-faced man in a brown suit who spoke slowly, as though each word had to clear a committee before he said it. He called me in on a Friday, 11 days after the funeral, and sat me across from his desk and looked at me the way you look at a piece of equipment you're not sure is worth repairing. He explained the lien. He explained the terms. He explained that the bank had carried the balance for 2 years already on account of the old man's reputation in the county, and that the same courtesy could not reasonably be extended to a boy who had not yet, as he put it, established himself. He said the word boy twice, maybe 3 times. He said September 1st, like it was a door closing, not a date. I asked him what the harvest would need to bring per bushel to clear it. He told me. He looked mildly surprised that I'd asked in those terms. I wrote the number in my notebook, the black one I'd bought at Deacon's Feed for 15 cents, and I stood up and thanked him for his time and walked out into a March wind that cut straight through to the bone. The drive out to Meeker Line took 22 minutes from the edge of Cordell. I know that because I counted them, the way you count things when you don't know what else to do with your hands. 4 miles of dirt road, 2 shallow creek crossings, 1 cattle gate I had to get out and open myself because the latch had rusted at an angle nobody had bothered to correct. The farmhouse came up on the left, gray and square in the early April light, sitting in the middle of a field that was still the pale tan of winter. But underneath that tan, if you looked close, was the faint suggestion of green. The turkey red was in the ground. The old man had put it in the previous October, and it had survived the winter, and it was beginning to show. That was the first thing I noted in the black notebook. April 4th, Friday. Winter wheat visible in northeast quadrant. Color adequate. The second thing I noted was the tractor. It was sitting inside the equipment shed with its side panel removed and its carburetor laid out on a feed sack on the dirt floor, each piece arranged in a row with the careful logic of a man who intended to finish the job but ran out of time. The Farmall F20, 1939, painted over in gray. I stood there and looked at it for a long time. It was not going to plant anything or pull anything or do anything at all until someone put it back together. The old hired hand found me standing there. He had been working for the family for 22 years, and he looked it. Not worn out exactly, but settled, like a fence post that has stopped worrying about the weather. He was 71 years old. He told me his daily rate was $2.10, and that he had been paid that same rate for the last 4 years, and he saw no reason to renegotiate. He also told me, without much warmth, that he had watched 3 men try to farm this ground, and 2 of them had left inside of 18 months. I asked him if he was staying. He looked at the tractor, he looked at me. He said he hadn't decided. He stayed. The barn, when I walked it that first afternoon, was in better shape than I'd expected. The north wall sound, the loft floor solid, the roof holding in all the places that mattered. I wrote that down too. Barn, serviceable. Denton Marsh came over the second morning. He was a large man, 56 years old, with acreage to the west and a way of looking at a property that told you he'd been thinking about it before he drove over. He stood at the fence line and talked about the hard season ahead and the price of diesel and the state of the county's water table, and then, folding his arms, he made me an offer for the land. I told him no. He asked me why. I told him I hadn't decided on a reason yet, but the answer was still no. April came in cold and then turned mean. The kind of mean that doesn't announce itself, just a steady pressure from the northwest that kept the temperature 15 degrees below where it ought to have been and dried the topsoil into something that crunched under your boots like old bread. I watched it and wrote it down. April 7th. Wind, NW, sustained. Top inch gone to powder. Subsoil holding. The tractor needed more than I'd admitted to myself when I first walked the shed. The Farmall was gray, where someone had repainted it, badly, over original red, and the gray was peeling back now, in long strips so the machine looked diseased, mottled, uncertain of what it wanted to be. A fair description of the operation in general. The carburetor was fouled, one of the magneto points had corroded through, and whoever had last serviced the air cleaner had done it wrong enough that I had to wonder whether they'd meant to. I found a manual in the shed, grease-stained, the spine cracked so it opened flat of its own will to the section on carburetor adjustment, which told me something about what had troubled the old man at the end. I worked through it page by page. The old hired hand watched the first afternoon without speaking. On the second day, he corrected my torque on the manifold bolt, said one word, "more," and then went quiet, and stayed quiet for the rest of the week, only handing me tools when my hands were occupied, and I reached out blindly. That was his version of praise, I came to understand. He gave it the way a careful man gives anything irreplaceable, sparingly, and only when he was sure. By the 20th of April, the farm all ran. Not perfectly, there was still a hesitation at low throttle I couldn't locate, but it ran, and it pulled, and when I drove it the length of the east field and back, the old man was leaning on the fence post watching, and when I climbed down he said it was better than he'd expected. I wrote that down too. It was somewhere in that week, I can't fix the exact evening, that he mentioned the north field. We were at the workbench after supper, and he said, almost to himself, that the old man used to walk the north field at night, not in the morning, not at dusk, at night, when there was no reason to be out there that the old hand could see. He said it without elaboration, the way a man mentions something he has not yet made sense of. I waited for the rest of it. He picked up a wrench, turned it over once, set it down. Changed the subject to the magneto. I let him change it. But I wrote down what he'd said. Northfield, nights, why? The question sat in my notebook through the rest of April and into May unanswered. May ended without ceremony. One morning the sky was the pale, washed color it gets after a long rain, and the next morning it was white, not clouds, just white, and the air had a different weight to it, something drier and more deliberate, like a door had closed somewhere to the north. I wrote June 2nd, no rain, wind shifting southwest in my notebook, and didn't think much of it yet. By the 6th, the wind had texture. You could feel the grit in it by midday, a fine dusting that settled on the windowsills and on the water in the stock tank, and on the back of your hand if you held it still long enough. I walked the field that evening. The turkey red looked good, the heads were filling, the color right, but the soil between the rows had a crust forming at the edges, the kind that forms when the top half-inch dries faster than what's underneath. I crouched down and pressed 2 fingers into the earth near the fence line. Maybe 3 inches of moisture. Maybe. The neighbor's field to the west told the story more plainly. By the 12th of June, his wheat had gone from green to something between green and gray, a color that isn't a color so much as an absence of one. I could see it from the road. I noticed the old hand looking at it too, from the gate, his hat in his hand, not saying anything. He put his hat back on and walked toward the barn. The county paper ran a piece on the 15th about well levels dropping in the eastern townships. A man from the extension office was quoted saying it was early to worry. I wrote his name down and underlined it, early to worry. My own field was holding, but I didn't trust it. I knew what the math looked like. The water table under this part of the county was not bottomless, and if the rains didn't come by July, the wheat would show stress, no matter what the soil had stored from winter. I needed to understand the north field. I needed to understand what the old man had been looking for out there at night. I was cleaning the grain bin office on a Thursday afternoon, the 17th, I think, sweeping out the chaff and mouse droppings that had accumulated along the back wall, pulling the shelving unit out from the corner to get behind it. The shelf was fixed to the wall on 3 sides, but the backing wasn't nailed. It was just fitted, a piece of 1/4-inch board cut to size and set in place. It came loose when I pulled the shelving unit too hard. I caught it before it fell. Behind it was a narrow gap between the backing and the exterior wall, maybe 4 inches of dead space, and in that gap, lying flat, something wrapped in a piece of oilcloth. I set the board against the wall. I reached in with both hands. The oilcloth was stiff and brown at the edges, tied with a length of kitchen twine that had dried to the consistency of wire. I worked the knot loose standing right there in the grain bin office, the late afternoon light coming through the single window at a low angle, catching the dust I'd kicked up. Inside the cloth was a notebook, green cover, maybe 4 inches by 6. The initials EV stamped into the lower right corner of the front, deep enough that you could feel them with your thumb. I didn't open it right away. I stood there holding it, feeling the weight of it, which was more than a notebook that size ought to weigh. Or maybe that was just me. I brought it back to the house and set it on the kitchen table and made a plate of whatever I had, and I waited until dark. I don't know why I waited. It felt like a thing that required dark. The first pages were survey notes, hand-drawn, in pencil, tight and exact, the kind of lettering a man does when he is trying to be understood by someone who isn't in the room with him yet. Elevations marked in feet and tenths of feet. Distances in yards, a north arrow drawn freehand, not quite straight, and the words Northfield, verified grade, October 1931, written along the top margin. It took me the better part of the first night to understand what I was looking at. He had dug a channel, not a ditch, a channel, subsurface, lined in places with flat stone, following the natural grade of the Northfield at a depth of 18 inches. The drawings showed it running from a point he'd marked only as source, somewhere behind the north barn, down through the field in a shallow arc, with lateral branches drawn in lighter pencil, like the veins in a leaf. At the bottom of the page, in a different pencil, darker, he'd written a single line: "Gravity does the work if you give it a reason." I sat with that sentence for a long time. The second night I read the calculations. He had done the math on flow rates, on soil permeability, on how long a slow source could sustain 18 inches of lateral movement through packed clay and wheat-root soil. The numbers were careful and they held up. I worked them myself in the margins of my own notebook, and they held up. But it was the entry near the back that stopped me. Not engineering, just words. October 15th. Seeded the North 40 with turkey red. Won't see it come in. But someone will. I set the notebook down on the table. The kerosene lamp made the shadows move. He had planted that wheat in October, knowing he was dying. He had left the seed in the ground and the water underneath it and the maps in the wall, and he had trusted that whoever came after would be paying close enough attention to find them. I sat there a long time. The lamp burned low. I woke Gus before the sun came up. He was already dressed, which told me he hadn't slept much either. He was sitting at the small table in the bunkhouse with a tin cup of something that had gone cold, and when I knocked and pushed the door open, he looked at me the way a man looks at you when he's been waiting for you to arrive. I didn't explain everything. I just said I'd found something in the grain bin and I needed him to come look at the north field with me. He set the cup down and stood up without asking a single question. That was the kind of man he was. We went out in the gray dark, just the two of us, carrying a spade and a pry bar, and the notebook wrapped in a flour sack to keep the dew off it. The north field was quiet and still. The wheat was still standing, thin and showing its bones, but standing. Around it, to the west and south as far as I could see in that low light, the neighboring fields were the color of old paper. The notebook put the hatch 80 feet back from the north wall of the barn, measured due north from the fourth corner post. I stepped it off. Gus walked beside me without speaking. There was nothing to see at first, just flat ground packed hard as brick, with a crust of old straw chaff pressed into it by 20 years of weight and weather. I crouched down and started clearing the surface with my hands. The straw came away in matted sheets. Underneath was dirt the color of iron, and then, about 4 inches down, iron itself, a disk of it, roughly circular, maybe 30 inches across, with a recessed lip along one edge that had a gap just wide enough for the pry bar. I looked at Gus. He nodded once. It took both of us. The ground had grown over the lip and the rust had done its work, but the bar found the gap and we leaned into it together, and the hatch came up with a sound like a held breath finally released. The cold came up first. Then the smell, mineral and clean, like stone that had never been warm. I leaned over the edge and looked down. Dark water, maybe 4 feet below the lip of the hatch. Still, perfectly still. It reflected the pale sky back up at us in a rough circle. I picked up a pebble and dropped it in. The sound it made was deep and full. 18,000 gallons. The spring had never stopped. Through the heat and the dry years and the dust, and all the time that had passed since 1931, the spring had kept filling it, and the old man had built it right, and it was here. Gus lowered himself down and sat on the edge of the hatch with his legs hanging over the side. He looked into the water for a long time. He didn't say anything at all. The first week of July came in like something had settled a debt. The temperature hit 102 on the third day and didn't come back down. The grass along the road went from yellow to white. The sky turned that particular shade of blue that isn't beautiful. It's the color of a thing that has forgotten how to do anything but burn. I started on the channel lines the morning after we found the water. The notebook had laid it all out in careful strokes. The grades, the branch points, the distances from the cistern to the field perimeter. He had thought it through the way a man thinks through something he expects to need long after he's gone. Every notation was precise. I bought a second-hand surveyor's level from a man in Cordell for $4 and worked out how to use it by trial and failure over the first day. By the end of that day, I had blisters on both palms and a straight line of roughly 60 feet regraded and cleared. Gus worked alongside me when his back allowed. When it didn't, he sat at the head of the trench and told me what he saw. He had been watching things for a long time, and his eyes were still good. The old channels hadn't disappeared. They had just been buried under 2 decades of silt and compressed earth and indifference. You could find them if you knew to look. They ran just below the surface skin of the field, like veins under old skin. And once I got the first section open and let a test flow run down from the cistern, the water found them on its own. It moved the way water always moves when it finds the grade it was meant to follow, not rushing, just going. I worked from first light until I could no longer see the stake flags. Every evening, when the light went long and red across the field, I could see him at his fence line. He was a careful man and he didn't make a show of it. He would ride the fence the way any farmer rides a fence at the end of a day, checking wire and post, but his horse would slow when it reached the corner nearest my field. He would sit there a minute, then he would ride on. On the 9th of July, he came to the gate. He offered $300 more than the last time. He said it in the same flat, neighborly tone a man uses when he's decided to be generous and wants you to notice. He said he could see I was working hard, and he didn't want to see a young man work himself to nothing for a field that wasn't going to give anything back. I thanked him. I told him the field wasn't for sale. He looked at the open trench running along the north fence, at the stake flags catching the evening wind. He didn't say anything more. He turned his horse and rode back. I picked up the spade. 9 days after Denton Marsh rode back to his own side of the fence, the county agent came out. He arrived in a government Ford, dark blue, dusty to the window glass, and he carried a clipboard with a leather backing and a mechanical pencil. He clicked 3 times before he wrote anything. His name was Horace Bridle. He was perhaps 50, heavy-set through the shoulders, with a face that had spent 30 years deciding how bad things actually were. That summer, things were very bad, and his face showed the accumulation of it. He had driven Harlan County for 3 weeks straight by then, field to field, recording what the drought had taken. He walked my wheat without being invited to, the way an assessor walks, purposeful, unhurried, already composing the number in his head. I followed a few steps behind. The stand was knee-high and green, running even along the rows, no curl to the leaf, no gray undertone that comes when a plant starts rationing itself. I watched him see it. I watched the clipboard lower slightly. He stopped at the 3rd row in and crouched down, put 2 fingers into the soil near the base of a stem, pressed, pulled his fingers back and rubbed them together, feeling for moisture. He stayed in that crouch for a long moment. When he stood, he looked at me. He asked how the stand was holding. I said, "Good drainage." He looked back at the row, then at the trench line along the north fence, the tamped earth where I'd refilled the cuts, the slight discoloration in the soil that ran in a line, if you knew what you were looking at. He clicked his pencil once, wrote something in the ledger, not much, 3 or 4 words. I didn't ask what. He asked again, same question, same flat voice. "How is the stand holding?" I said it the same way I'd said it the first time. Good drainage. He studied me the way older men study a young face when they're deciding whether to press or let a thing lie. Then he nodded, one short nod, and wrote something else. He thanked me for my time in the way a government man thanks you. Efficient. No warmth meant by it, no coldness either. Just the end of a transaction. I walked him back to the road. He opened his car door, set the clipboard on the seat. Before he got in, he looked back once. Not at me. At the field, the green of it against the brown of everything that surrounded it on every side. Then he got in and drove toward Cordell, and the dust closed behind him. The last week of July came in hot enough to crack the paint on the barn's south side. I had stopped sleeping past 4 in the morning by then. I would rise before the light, pull on my boots without fully waking, and walk the north field with a lantern, checking the soil at the base of the stalks by feel. The wheat was holding, but I could feel the weight of the season bearing down on everything, on the air itself, which had a bleached quality to it, colorless and heavy. On the 28th, I sat down at the kitchen table with my black notebook and did the arithmetic. I had been tracking the cistern level every 3 days using a knotted rope I dropped through the iron hatch. The spring had been giving close to 400 gallons a day through June. By mid-July, it had dropped. I estimated 260 gallons per day now, maybe less by August. The cistern stood at 9,000 gallons. I wrote the numbers in a column. The wheat needed 8 more days to reach harvest maturity. The kernels still soft in the center, not yet dry enough to cut. I needed to keep the channel gates open through the 1st of August at minimum. The math came out close enough to make my jaw tighten. 4 days of margin. That was all. If the spring held at 260, if I didn't lose a gate seal, if the temperatures didn't spike above what they'd already been, 4 days. I sat with that for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the windmill turned slowly, more from habit than from wind. I had kept one gate closed, the furthest lateral, the one that fed the southwest corner of the field. I'd been rationing, protecting the margin. The southwest corner was thinner than the rest, the stand slightly less dense, and I had been telling myself it was a calculated decision. But sitting there with the numbers in front of me, I knew it for what it was: fear. I went out before full dark. Gus was already asleep in the bunk room off the north barn. I walked to the gate alone, carrying the lantern and the wrench. The handle was stiff. It hadn't moved in 2 weeks. I set my weight against it. When it turned, I heard the water start moving through the channel below the ground. I couldn't see it. I just heard it, a low, traveling sound, like something waking up. I had committed every gallon I had left to an August 3rd cut. There was nothing to take back now. The morning of August 3rd came in cool, the way Kansas mornings sometimes do before the heat remembers itself. I was up at 4:30. Gus had the flatbed running by 5. The borrowed McCormick binder sat in the yard where I'd left it the night before, belt checked, blade cleaned. I'd driven to the Hendricks place 3 miles north on Tuesday to ask for it, hat in hand, explaining what I had. Old Roy Hendricks hadn't said much. He'd just walked me to the shed and helped me hitch it to the Ford, without asking whether I was sure about the timing. That was its own kind of kindness. We started on the north end of the field at first light. The turkey red stood chest high in the rows that the channel fed, heavy-headed, the grain still firm. I could feel it in my hands when I walked the edge ahead of the binder, the way the stalks resisted, the weight of a real yield. Around us, in every direction, The neighboring fields were the color of old bone. He was at the fence by 7:30. Denton Marsh stood with one boot up on the lowest rail and his arms folded across the top wire, watching. He didn't call out. He didn't ask questions. He stood there the entire morning. I could see him from the seat of the binder on every pass, and he never moved except to shift his weight. I don't know what that cost him to do. I didn't think about it much at the time. I kept my eyes on the rows. We had all 34 acres cut and bundled by early afternoon. The Cordell grain elevator took the yield at $2.91 a bushel. The man who wrote the ticket didn't comment on my age. He wrote the number, I signed the ticket, and he handed me cash in an envelope that was thick enough that I had to press it flat to put it in my shirt pocket. I walked to First Consolidated from the elevator. 12 blocks. Raymond Pell was at his desk. He looked up when I came in, and I saw him recognize me before his expression had time to settle into anything deliberate. I set the envelope on the desk in front of him. I told him the amount. He counted it twice. I watched his lips move, then he opened the top drawer of his desk, retrieved the lien document, and stamped it paid with a stamp that left a red mark across my grandfather's name. He said something after that. I don't remember what it was. I folded my copy, put it in my coat pocket, and walked back out into the August heat. That afternoon, after the walk back from the bank, I went to the cistern. I don't know exactly why. The harvest was done, the debt was cleared, and there was a farmhouse 30 yards away where I could have sat down for the first time in months. But I went to the cistern instead, and I crouched at its edge, and I took out the folding knife I kept in my work pants, and I began scraping at the last inch of compacted dirt along the northern rim of the concrete lip. The section I had never fully cleared. I had been close to it a dozen times that summer and always turned to something more urgent. There was nothing urgent now. It took maybe 10 minutes. The concrete beneath was rough poured, the kind a man does alone without a form. And then the blade caught something cut rather than cast. Lines made by a tool, deliberate and small, and I leaned in close enough that my shadow fell across them and I had to shift to let the light back in. 2 letters, a date, nothing else. I stayed there for a long time, with my hand resting on the edge. Not thinking anything specific, just letting it settle. The fact that he had knelt in this same spot 21 years before I was born, in the middle of another drought, and pressed something sharp into wet concrete, and then covered it over and said nothing to anyone, and waited. He waited a long time. I took the green notebook out of my coat and set it on the concrete lip, centered, the initials facing up. I left it there for a moment. Then I picked it up again and held it. I'm older now. When I look back at that summer, I see a boy who didn't know how close he came to losing everything. He was saved not by cleverness, but by patience. His grandfather's patience, laid into the ground a generation before he arrived. The land had been holding something in trust, and all the boy had to do was open the right drawer, read the right page, and trust what he found there. There are drawers like that on every old farm, notebooks behind false backs, hatches under 20 years of straw, names carved into concrete where no one thought to look. If you've got land that belonged to someone before you, go slow through the buildings they left. Don't be in a hurry to modernize what you don't yet understand. The old ones were not always wrong. Sometimes they were just early. I set the notebook down on the cistern lip, and I walked back toward the farmhouse, and the field behind me was already turning gold in the late light.